And the time is up. So in my intro, I would definitely have a sentence or two about both models. You don't have to be as detailed as I am here. You can use that explanation later on, but I suggest you have at least a sentence for each model. And of course, refer back to the deflationary gap definition if you have already defined it in part A. If it hasn't come up in part A, then of course, this is the time to explain what it is. My thesis statement reads, the Keynesian model argues that an economy can remain stuck in the deflationary gap due to wage and price rigidity, preventing automatic recovery. Unlike the monetarist model, which assumes flexible prices restore full employment, Keynesians emphasize that falling aggregate demand can lead to prolonged stagnation, as seen in Japan's lost decade and the slow US recovery after the 2008 financial crisis. Government intervention is necessary to boost demand, of course aggregate demand, and close the gap, as economic growth might not get restored automatically. I'll put that aggregate there, okay? So aggregate demand. Now the diagram I would use obviously would be the two models, starting off with the monetarist model. As you can see, the LRES curve is vertical at the full employment level of output, and if AD for whatever reason shifts down, causing a short-run deflationary development, and we have an equilibrium at the red dot there, that means this is going to be offset by an outward shift of the SRAS curve in the long run. Why? Because according to this model, in the long run, if there are lots of unemployed resources, their costs will go down. And that will shift the SRAS to the right, restoring the full employment level of output at YFE, which is also the potential output of an economy. If AD were to increase and get boosted from AD1 to AD3, we would arrive to that red dot outside of the potential output of the economy. But that would mean that in the long run, resource prices would go up, and therefore, due to higher cost of production of firms, the SRAS curve is going to shift upwards, leading to a point C intersection between AD and the SRAS, new SRAS 3 here in the long run. Again, we are back at the potential output of the economy. So that essentially means that in the long run, even though there might be some short-term fluctuations in the short run, right? In the long run, these fluctuations will always be reduced and the economy will get restored automatically without any government intervention in the markets. The economy will automatically get back to full employment level of output, and all of that is because resource prices are flexible in the long run. Now that's exactly what the Keynesians don't agree with, because as you can see in this diagram, the Keynesian aggregate supply curve has this horizontal long part, and they argue that if AD falls down from AD1 to AD2 in this model, what's going to happen is that we are going to end up at point B, Y2, creating a recessionary gap, but this is not going to be a temporary short-term or short-run fluctuation in the economy, but the economy might actually get stuck there at that point B and Y2. Why is that? It's because if AD is falling and firms are losing revenues all around in the economy, across the whole economy, then they need to cut the costs. But unfortunately, they cannot cut the wages because of many reasons: minimum wage laws, workers' contracts, or labor union power. And for these reasons, it's simpler, easier, and quicker to just lay off the workers if they want to cut the wage costs. And especially that they don't have that many buyers anymore. They don't need that many workers, and therefore they can produce less. That's why production goes down, firms are going bankrupt, and there's less of labor, land, and capital used in the economy. And according to this model, those resources that remain in employment are actually receiving the same amount of income, so there's no real room for prices to go down. That's why the average price level stays pretty much the same as before, but GDP falls a lot and we might get stuck there. There could also be somewhat of a deflationary pressure as well, as you can see from this diagram, and that's exactly what happened to Japan in the 1990s. And they really got stuck there, and the only way out of here is to boost aggregate demand back up. This is what I would also explain in my analysis and evaluation: the Keynesian argument that deflationary gaps persist because of the inability of wages and prices to fall, and the Keynesian assumption that the aggregate supply curve has a long horizontal section, meaning that equilibrium GDP is lower than potential GDP. Equilibrium GDP being at Y2, potential GDP being at YFE. Okay, hence a fall in aggregate demand can lead to a deflationary spiral, and thus the economy can be stuck in a recessionary gap unless aggregate demand is boosted. How? Through government intervention. This will not lead to inflation though, as indicated by the price level increase being minimal between PL1 and PL2. The real world example I'd use is, as I said, Japan in the 1990s, and also perhaps you can talk about the financial crisis in the US. Through expansionary fiscal and monetary policy, the economy has recovered, although they needed a couple of years. Economic growth really picked up, but inflation indeed remained relatively low throughout the 2010s without much inflationary pressure, as 80 was boosted back up to 81. So that's a very, very good real-world example. And I would also explain the monetarist model, where wages and prices are assumed to be flexible, allowing markets to clear, thus maintaining full employment of resources. Hence, a fall in aggregate demand can only lead to short-run recessionary developments, and in the long run, resource prices will become cheaper. Actually, resource prices will become lower due to them being unemployed, and this could cause short-run aggregate supply curve to shift to the right, effectively closing the recessionary gap automatically without any government help. So in my conclusion, I would just have this concluding statement that this is why the two models are different. Their view about how resource prices can change, especially in the long term. And because of this difference in their views, according to the Keynesian model, we might actually be stuck in a recession, just as Japan's example shows us. So that's this question. Let's look at the next one. It's about economic growth. Explain 2 factors that could lead to economic growth for 10 marks. And your 2 minutes start now.